اليوم نحتفل بالفن الإسلامي الذي أقرته منظمة اليونسكو، والذي بادرت بإدراجه مملكة البحرين في 2018 عندما كانت مدينة المحرق العريقة عاصمة للثقافة الإسلامية. هذه المبادرة كانت فكرة وحلم لمعالي رئيسة الهيئة الشيخة ماي بنت محمد آل خليفة، من حلم إلى واقع. ونفخر بأننا اليوم وبعد إقرار هذا الحدث عالمياً ليكون منبراً به نستعيد أجمل ما تمتلكه الحضارة الإسلامية من فنون متنوعة وحية، والتي ما زال تأثيرها واستمراريتها قائم إلى يومنا هذا. هذا الغنى ما زال يلهم الشباب، ومكونات حرفها، حرف هذه الحضارة، حرف هذه الفنون ما زالت حية في مجتمعاتنا. وها نحن اليوم نلتقي رغم الظروف التي تحول من التواصل بشكل حي عبر هذه المنصة الإلكترونية. نلتقي للحوار، نلتقي للتواصل من مملكة البحرين، وبالتحديد من متحف البحرين الوطني. نلتقي في هذه الندوة مع ضيوفنا الكرام المتحدثين لنفتح صفحات التاريخ ونستعرض معا جمال وغنى عالمنا الإسلامي بفنونه وحضارته. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure and honor to speak to you today from the Kingdom of Bahrain to celebrate with you the International Day of Islamic Arts. In 2018, Muharram, our rich city of heritage, the mother of a unique World Heritage Site, the Pearling Path, was selected to be capital of Islamic culture in 2018. Her Excellency, Sheikha May bint Mohammed Al Khalifa, the President of the Bahrain Authority for Culture and Antiquities, had a vision. She had a dream to celebrate Islamic arts on a global scale. From a vision to a reality, we are all here today, first to welcome our esteemed panelists and scholars, to highlight the beauty, to highlight the wealth and the legacy of our Islamic culture. Thank you all for being with us on this virtual platform. We do hope that every institution worldwide will add their own story on a yearly basis to highlight and address the diversity of Islamic arts. We believe here in the Bahrain Authority for Culture and Antiquities, and it's at the core of our practice, that through culture and arts we can achieve the highest forms of knowledge, wealth, and connectivity. I will leave you now with my dear colleague, Haya Essada, Cultural Manager, and our esteemed panel to begin this talk. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Sheikha Hela bint Mohammed Al Khalifa, Director General.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheikha Hela. Welcome all to this panel discussion in which we hope to explore the large territory of what is termed Islamic art, its definition, how we engage with it today, and the opportunities and possibilities for the future. I am both honored and delighted to present our esteemed panelists who are experts in the field of Islamic art. With us today is Dr. Ulrike Al-Khamis, the Director of Collections and Public Programs, as well as the Interim Director of the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. She has over 25 years of experience as a curator and a senior advisor for museum and cultural projects in the UAE and Scotland. And last year, she co-curated the exhibition, The Moon, a Voyage Through Time. Also with us is Dr. Heba Barakat, who is an art historian and a museum specialist and head of curatorial affairs at the Islamic Arts Museum in Malaysia. She has authored and contributed to over 40 publications and recently collaborated with the British Museum on 2 exhibitions entitled Inspired by the East, How the Islamic World Influenced Western Art, and The Arabesque in Introduction. And of course, last but not least, Seif El-Rashidi is an architectural historian, the director of the Barakat Trust, and a technical reviewer for the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. His expertise is linked to heritage preservation and managing projects related to the promoting public engagement with heritage and culture. He also recently co-authored a book entitled Tent Makers of Cairo, Egypt's Medieval and Modern Applied Craft from the American University of Cairo Press. We really appreciate your time and being with us here to discuss this rich topic. Just a small housekeeping note for everybody that's also joined and is joining us virtually today. At the end of the discussion, we will have an opportunity for some Q&A. So please do write to us in the banner at the bottom of the screen. So maybe we should begin. Let's start by setting the stage. Dr. Ulrike, how would you define Islamic art?
This is one of the most complex questions in the history of world art. The way it is commonly understood today is actually built on an artificial construct, an artificial academic construct that was first started and then evolved from the late 19th through the 20th century by largely Western scholars who applied their intellectual curiosity and passion and academic searching to a culture, or should I say cultures, of enormous diversity and complexity that range geographically over thousands of miles, from Spain across Africa to China, over nearly 1,500 years. And also, of course, encompassed many cultures that were not exclusively Islamic. So in doing so, they applied their Western-centric traditional and conventional methodologies and parameters to examining these cultures and their material manifestations, their artistic, creative manifestations. And as a result, we have now a popular picture of Islamic art that is very diverse and is also, may I say, somewhat distorted if you look at it from within those very Muslim cultures that are being examined, because we have a kind of distorted understanding of priorities within the arts of the Muslim world, where perhaps in the popular mind, miniature paintings are so very, very important, but calligraphy is not. Whereas if you look at it from within, perhaps the status of calligraphy is still one of the highest within the understanding of the arts. There's also a focus on materiality that often discounts or ignores the equal importance of the intangible dimensions of an object. So, for example, traditionally within the arts and cultures of the Muslim world, poetry and literature have been sublime art forms in their own right, in their intangible manifestation, but the focus tends to always be in conventional art, Islamic art history, to focus nearly exclusively on the material manifestation of those intangible art forms. A third challenge is that many of the items we consider Islamic art today, in their time, were crafts. And while we consider them now within the context of Islamic art, if they are from the 15th century, we would never give the same respect and reverence to a manifestation of the continued craft in the 21st century. So there are several challenges and complexities when we look at this definition. And then the question comes, what is Islamic art to Muslims? الفن الإسلامي. What is it when Muslims look at it? And they would probably look at it in a much more spiritual way, where they would say absolutely a mihrab or a mosque lamp or a beautiful Quran manuscript or a calligraphy of one of the surahs is Islamic art, but a miniature painting of a royal scene is not necessarily seen as Islamic art. So there are many, many different ways of looking at it, and many, many questions we have to ask the discipline. And I would love to perhaps refer to Hibba to add to this understanding of Islamic art from within a Muslim culture, and then also invite Seif to talk a little bit about the dynamic between the understanding of what is art, what is craft, and who decides. So Hibba, if I can pass over to you a little bit.
Okay, but we, of course, at the Islamic Arts Museum Malaysia, we have to look at Islamic art and define it from actually our collection, from which actually draws from places and cultures stretching from Spain to China and ranging in time for almost 1400 years. So the collection actually represents the greatly diversity of artistic expressions of the Islamic world, ranging from the art of the book to, of course, all portable items. As you said, it's a really more material, expressed in a material form, but also we have to see it also from the intangible arts. So in Malaysia, of course, it is a little bit different. We also stretch it to the end of the 19th century, perhaps. In general, when we collect and we display at the museum, we look at Islamic art objects up to almost the colonization period of the main Islamic countries. So we stop in a way until the 19th century. But when it comes to Malaysia and Southeast Asia, we stretch it a little bit more up to the 20th century. So actually it has no boundaries and it has no time limits. It depends on where you are and how you approach and see it. But also the idea is that our understanding of the term Islamic art is really a little bit related to material culture that has affected and that affected the Islamic world all. So what we try to do now is to look at what binds them together rather than what separates them from each other. So we're trying to come up with a definition that is based on commonalities. And that is where Islamic art in Malaysia and Southeast Asia will fit properly.
Absolutely. And I think that inclusivity is a very important aspect because you often, of course, have artifacts within the history of Islamic art, which never stopped in the real sense. It didn't stop in the 19th century. It always continued in its own culture-specific, reality-specific, dynamic ways. Many of these aspects were shared by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. We have many aspects of Islamic art, say glassware or aspects of metalware or functional objects and even manuscripts of popular literature that would have been partaken of by all members of society across the religious divides, if you want to say. And the same goes, of course, for the crafts that have continued, the traditional crafts that we still find in the markets of some of the cities in the Islamic world at large. And Seif, you have a very dynamic relationship with the living arts and crafts, in particular in Egypt. So tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you, Ulrike. Well, I thought actually I'd show you some examples, which is a good way of telling. I'll just share my screen. And I thought that, I've chosen some examples from Egypt, but I thought that this was a very good example to respond to Ulrike's point about crafts and what is Islamic art today and what is Islamic art to Muslims. And I think this Ramadan lantern, which actually, you can't tell the size of it, but it's about 1.20 meters high, which I found in the market in Cairo a few years ago, which has, as you can see, a picture of the famous Egyptian footballer Muhammad Salah with the words in Arabic, Ramadan Kareem, or, in all definitions, this is an object produced in the Muslim world, for the Muslim world, to celebrate a very Muslim celebration, which is Ramadan. And it also celebrates another thing, which is a very important Egyptian or international sportsman. And I think that when you talk about the fact that, when we talk about the fact that many of the collections in museums today were craft objects, well, I think this is a contemporary equivalent of some of the objects that we see from the 13th century and the 14th century in the Museum of Islamic Arts in Malaysia or in Canada. And actually, one of the reasons I bought it is that I thought, what's the equivalent of one of these objects today? And I felt that this was the ultimate example, because it has great authenticity. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about. What are cultures producing for themselves? And I think this is an example of that. This is another example actually related to my work on the tent makers of Cairo, because the tent makers who produce, I mean, it's basically similar to quilting, produce a wide range of things for different audiences. This one is a piece with the 99 names of Allah, which I would say most people in a Muslim community or non-Muslim community or in many different contexts might recognize as an example of Islamic art that's produced today. It fits the perspectives that many people would agree, whatever those perspectives are. This one is a work by a contemporary artist, Rashid Qureshi. It's an amazing collection of banners, also made by made by hand in Cairo by the tent makers, and it has poetic verses and various designs. And this is much more the work of what we would call an artist rather than a craftsman. Of course, these are very difficult distinctions to make. But going back to my third example, or my first one, which I think is in some ways the most telling one, this is a tent that I found in Ramadan being used to prepare meals for the Ramadan iftar in Sayyida Nafisa, which is a very popular mosque in Cairo. And if you look at the tent, it has, well, the images of the Kaaba, short verses of the Quran, but very significantly, it has an image of a very important religious preacher who passed away, Sheikh Al-Sha'rawi, who was very popular among Egyptian and other audiences. And you see him sitting on a prayer carpet reading the Quran. So I thought the reason I chose it, of course, is that it challenges the notion of Islamic art not representing figures in a religious context, because this is a tent in a mosque and it depicts a religious figure and people are very comfortable with it. So I think that looking at craft, actually you get a whole range of things from this, which is made for very local audiences, to the work of Rashid Qureshi, which was exhibited and is exhibited internationally and is highly acclaimed, to the piece made by the tent makers as a good example of their craft. My second reflection is about architecture, which is the other topic of great interest to me. And this is a mosque, a modern mosque actually in Kazan in Tatarstan, which I would say meets the image of what people in Tatarstan feel mosques should look like: domes and blue tiles and minarets. It's contemporary. And I mean, I'm sure many art historians might dislike it, but it responds to the perception of what Islamic architecture might be in a religious context. This is a very contrasting example, but I think it's important. This is the headquarters of the Muslim Brotherhood in Cairo, which is by definition a very Muslim organization. And if you look at the way that they've designed their headquarters, all of their references are classical in inspiration. There are Corinthian columns and volutes and everything else. And I think that when you come to architecture in particular, defining what Islamic art is or what Islamic architecture is quite an interesting thing, because this is an example that a Muslim community decides, well, the way we want to represent our identity is not using architectural elements from our tradition, but using architectural elements from a very different tradition. And in a way, it's the last kind of, I mean, it's not the kind of building you'd expect the Muslim Brotherhood to design or to request. And I think actually it was probably built purposely to look European as a way of showing, well, just because we're Muslim doesn't make us part of a global world. So perhaps what I'm not doing, perhaps what I'm doing is challenging more than defining, but I think it's important sometimes to challenge. And my last example in this challenge is the Institute of the Arab World in Paris, which is a building which celebrates one of the cultures of the Muslim world, the Arab culture. It's in Paris. It's built by a French architect, Jean Nouvel, but it draws upon the tradition of Mashrabeya, or the lattice work screens, to control light entering the building. And this was awarded the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, which goes to buildings that serve places in the world where Muslim communities have a significant presence. So in this case, Paris, you might not think of the Islamic world. The architect isn't Muslim. It's a contemporary building, but it does, in a way, capture the principles and the ideas and the traditions of Islamic architecture. And so I hope in these 6 examples, I've kind of challenged a bit and provoked a bit, and also reaffirmed what Ulrike and Heba were saying.
Amazing, Seif. I think this is wonderful, and it in a few images really sums up the dilemma that we have with Islamic art, and also the way that we should perhaps look at moving it into the future. So we have the outside looking in, then we have the inside giving meaning to their own culture and expressing in material terms their own convictions. And then we have the need for dialogue between the two narratives, as it were, because a holistic understanding of Islamic art, if ever it were possible, and it isn't because it is such a massive and complex subject, but the solution would lie in that the scholarship around the world progresses the field in dialogue and takes account of the ways in which cultures understand their own artistic production, historically and contemporary, because as we look back in history, whether we are from the region or we are scholars from elsewhere, by definition, we are looking back at something for which the complete story is no longer in existence, and we have to reconstruct it. And part of that, of course, is projecting our own contemporary notions and understandings and interpretations onto the piece that is in front of us. But I think what you've shown through your slide, Seif, is really the need to understand in dialogue from within and from without. Thank you.
Thank you, Seif. Thank you, Ulrike. Perhaps we go back to Dr. Hibba. I'd really like to know more about what is happening within the Islamic Museum in Malaysia, Arts Museum in Malaysia, especially since it is the largest museum in Southeast Asia.
Yes, true. The Islamic Arts Museum Malaysia is the largest, actually. It's a home to the largest collection of Islamic art in Malaysia as well as in Southeast Asia. And we try to, of course, disseminate this information to Asia mainly first, and of course to the rest of the world as well. Let me also try to share some of my slides so that we can see what we are doing now at okay, so actually, yeah, this is the Islamic Arts Museum Malaysia. I move, yeah, this is the slide. This is our portal, entrance portal. And as you see, we have incorporated some of the classical understanding of what is Islamic art, which is tiles and which is calligraphy, and a dome that means look here distorted, but it's not really distorted. Otherwise, it's a very modern and clean architecture, modern architecture is full of life. And of course, through our galleries, which we have like two permanent levels, two permanent gallery levels. we try to actually show all of our collection, as you see, of Islamic art, which ranges from the material culture, but also we include ideas, and we have space for to display actually intangible material like the puppet shows, the shadow puppets, which is a wayu kulli in Malaysian, but also we do other things. So what are we doing now, and how are we disseminating this information, and how we are actually incorporating other ideas? So today within our temporary galleries, we attempt to facilitate understanding across cultures and explore the boundaries of what Islamic art means today. So we welcome the exhibition Face, Fashion and Fusion from the Museum of Applied Art and Sciences from Australia, which displayed the contemporary Islamic fashion trends in Muslim diaspora in Australia. So this is unlike many of the other traditional approaches to Islamic art. We can actually open up to ideas. And I think this is exactly what we do want to be. So also, and in few months, we will host a joint exhibition with the British Museum called Inspired by the East, how the Islamic world influenced Western art, which highlights through a collection of Orientalist paintings, the rich dialogue and the mutual exchange of ideas during the 18th and 19th century. And of course, this we actually not only see it from their point of view as what they have been looking at us with their own eye, but also what we have been actually also looking at them. So in a way, it is mutual. And of course, we still feel that calligraphy plays the most important, objects or subjects that represents Islamic art today. So when we were looking at what is Islamic art today from our perspective from a museum, which is actually a historical museum, that we need to create some kind of like boundaries to our permanent display. So we felt that calligraphy can still move on up to the 20th and 21st century, not just because calligraphy has always been at a higher level of art, as Ulrike has said, but also because what we see today is something that we can understand more, and it can fit more in our traditional historical museums in a way. But of course, that is not just it. We accordingly promote calligraphy and promote contemporary Islamic calligraphy and calligraphic installations. So in a way, this is going to be our trend now on.
This is
and
excellent.
I give back the floor to all of you.
Dr. Heba, thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask you also, you work both with East and West, so you're also working with the National Museum in Tokyo, that is correct? So how is your engagement?
Yes, that's
with
very
them
correct. We have been working.
Sorry, carry on.
Okay, we have been for the past 2.5 years almost working with Tokyo National Museum, preparing an exhibition which is going to be called 14 Dynasties and a Region. And of course, it's an introduction to Islamic art, and it's not just a historical introduction to these dynasties, but also to show the shared art and aesthetics that has actually touched all our lives and even still touches our lives today. We've been working with Tokyo, we worked with Australia, we worked with, of course, Singapore and Thailand and all of these areas around us. But of course, because Malaysia is a multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic society, we actually see Islamic art as having contributed to all of these cultures within Malaysia. So now what we are producing, or what is Malaysia producing, is something like a mix of all cultures, but yet maybe have some weight in the Islamic world. So we are still, like investigating, monitoring what's going on in Malaysia and around the world.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that people in the Middle East want to learn more about what's happening within Asia, because I think we feel in some way a bit distanced from that, more towards a Eurocentric approach, or knowing more about what's happening in the West and knowing more of what's Muslim societies, are working on and aspiring to. So if we can also hear from Dr. Ulrike, who's working in Canada and in a very different kind of society, a multi-ethnic society. So how is your work with the Aga Khan in terms of your collection and what you showcase and what conversation you'd like to have with your audiences? Dr. Ulrike, you're on mute.
Our museum was inaugurated in Canada for a very specific reason, because His Highness really saw an alignment, philosophical alignment, if you like, between the pluralistic values of Canada and its commitment to building harmonious multicultural societies in its midst, with the mission of the museum, which is to bridge cultures and promote pluralism through the lens of Muslim arts and culture. So we have a very unique mandate in that respect, and everything we do, whether that is through our historic displays, through our temporary exhibitions, and of course also through our increasing engagement with contemporary arts and contemporary artists, is directed towards living that pluralistic and intercultural mandate. And how we do this, we have a collection of about 1,200 objects ranging in date from the 7th to the 21st century, and of course having many of the acknowledged international masterpieces of Islamic art, particularly in the domain of works on paper and manuscripts, but also ceramics, metalwork, glass, the usual selection of what you would expect in a high quality Islamic art collection. But we see this collection really in a sense as a metaphor of the society of Canada, because our objects have come together from all corners of the world. And each one of them really has a multitude of stories to tell as an immigrant to Canada. So what I personally always say, if we set the objects that we have free from the conventional Islamic art discourse, and we allow each object to tell a multitude of stories that actually still have a very immediate relevance for our contemporary lives today, then not only can we engage Islamic art scholars, and of course we do want to engage them as well, but we want to demonstrate to a broader public that these historical objects have important stories to tell about our lives today across cultures. So I want to give you a quick example of what I mean by this. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Hopefully this will work. Can you see this slide I have for you?
Yes.
So I brought you two objects,
yes,
two random objects from our collection. The first one, magnificent classical Iznik dish from Ottoman Turkey, dated to the 16th century. Now, objects in our collection can tell stories departing from their material, from their design, or from their content, what they represent. their meaning. So in this case, if you look at this plate, you will see that it depicts tulips. Now, all of us can relate to tulips, and in Canada here particular now, tulips are among really what we consider national flowers. And we have tulip festivals and tulip plantings every spring. It's the most wonderful thing we see after our long, dark winters. But how did the tulip come to Canada? It came to Canada because the Dutch queen, during the war, was sent to Canada for safety with her daughters and gave birth to her third daughter in Ottawa. And then after the war, when she was back in the Netherlands as queen, and in gratitude, she started sending tulips to Canada. And that has now become an annual act of friendship between Canada and the Netherlands. But then where did the Netherlands get the tulips from? We know the Netherlands as the main producer of the tulips, but that wouldn't have been possible if in the 16th century, 17th century, the Dutch wouldn't have got the tulips through the intermediary, and it's a long story, of an Austrian ambassador who had brought the first bulbs back from the Ottoman Empire, where in Istanbul, the sultans, the officials, the elite had a whole culture and horticulture around the tulip. Why? Not only because it was a beautiful flower, but because its name in Persian has the same letters as the word for Allah, and thereby it had a mystical affiliation. So the Turks in turn got the tulip ultimately from the Central Asian steppes. So here in one plate, you can talk about a story, a trajectory that we can all relate to wherever we are in the world, wherever our cultural or religious background is. And it's an object that unites. On the other side here, I give you a manuscript from the early 17th century, created in Isfahan, Iran, of the Masnavi by Jalaluddin Rumi. Now, the actual artwork here fundamentally is the work. It's not the manuscript. The manuscript is just one of the materializations of the original work, if you like. But the interesting thing here is that the original work was written in the 13th century. So already you get a sense that it must have been so important that 400 years later, it is still honored in a beautifully illustrated manuscript. And of course, by that time, Rumi was already celebrated all over many regions of the Muslim world. But there's another significance to us in our days today, because Rumi was a refugee. Rumi was an immigrant. Rumi had to flee with his family in the wake of the Mongol invasions from his birthplace in either Afghanistan or Tajikistan westwards. And the family went to Baghdad, the family went to Mecca, the family went to Damascus, and eventually they ended up in Konya, Turkey. And here, this refugee wrote a masterpiece in a Turkish city in Persian, which became so famous that to this day, in the 21st century, Rumi is the most translated foreign poet in the whole of North America. So in this case, then the object stands as a symbol of what a displaced person, a nobody, a refugee can achieve in their new host societies. So I just wanted to give you these two examples to invite you to think about what we call Islamic art in a way that actually allows an inclusive discussion, departing from these individual objects as catalysts for building multicultural conversations over which people from different camps, if you like, can come together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ulrike. This is an extremely important point, especially in a world where, you know, I think migration has never been so large. We need to see the ability of migrants and how they can contribute to any society that they can be a part of. So I'm sure within your museum, you highlight these objects in this kind of sense. And that's why they probably resonate with an audience, with a Canadian audience. Is that correct?
We do this through many different ways. I mean, we do it through education moments like this one. We also increasingly look at how we can tackle these kind of topics in our temporary exhibitions. So we have a performing arts program that looks at it through the more intangible lens. So we are always on the lookout of making the case for using art as a unifier across cultures, making people realize that they all have something to bring to the table of humanity through the arts and through culture. And it is something that is perhaps more needed than ever in this situation at the moment, because for anyone who had thought that the arts were on the parameters and they were, you know, for the elite only, the crisis has shown us how central the arts, in the broadest sense, are for our sanity. I mean, here in Canada, for example, you cannot imagine the amount of people that have turned to making art, you know, whether that is crafting, or whether it's painting, or whether it's making music, or whether, dare I say it, it's checking out new recipes, which is also an art, especially in Islamic cultures, right? It has shown that people look for solace and they look for reaffirmation and they look for hope in the arts. So we actually have an amazing advantage working in this field.
That is exactly correct. I mean, we are here to showcase to the world the beauty and the manifestations of all these different societies and cultures and peoples that have come together and connected to create something, you know, of value and beauty. Maybe we can move to Dr. Seif now. With your work in the Barakat Trust and providing training and education, how do you see these values embodied in Islamic art? You know, how do you express them through your work?
Well, actually, for us, I mean, the reason the Barakat Trust was established in the 1980s, in 1987, was due to the observation that there weren't enough people in the Islamic world who had the skills and the interest and the knowledge to preserve its art and heritage effectively. And so the Barakat Trust provides grants to support people to study Islamic art, but also to undertake preservation, to train conservators or curators, to develop craft projects that are inspired by the past. And one of our academic advisory committee, Zainab Yurekli Gorkai, one of the things she said stuck in my head, which is that better scholarship leads to better understanding, and better understanding leads to better preservation. And so our aim is really to encourage and foster and help bring about better preservation of the cultural heritage of the Islamic world. And we do that, as I said, I mean, by both enabling better scholarship, but also better training and better education of the practitioners of heritage and of culture. And I think any organization grows and evolves and reflects and responds to those reflections. And if you look at the trajectory of the Barakat Trust since 1987, we started off focusing mainly on academic and very technical things. And now we're also, for example, this year, one of the grants we gave was to a craft project in the City of the Dead in Cairo, which was to link a British leather jewelry designer to poor, underprivileged women in the cemetery in Cairo to teach them to use leather scraps to make jewelry as a form of generating income. And so the way that we approach Islamic art and the crafts of the Islamic world and the heritage of the Islamic world is that there are many, many different ways of preserving it. And one of them is to produce generations of scholars that understand it and interpret it and share it through museums and museum collections. Another one is to empower the people in the field and give them the resources they need to preserve this heritage. And the third one is to make it valuable and viable to people who would otherwise not have the privilege or the luxury to perhaps look at a beautiful marble panel and think, oh, isn't this wonderful? This is part of my culture and my heritage. And so we do different things. The other thing that we're a UK-based charity, and one of the things that's extremely important, and it's something that Ulrike already spoke about, is how can we use the arts of the Islamic world to convey more about the culture of the Islamic world, or the cultures of the Islamic world, to encourage people to discover it, to see its beauty, to see its depth. And I think that it's not only people unfamiliar with the cultures of the Islamic world that are important to us from this perspective. I also think it's that often Muslim communities know a bit about their own culture, but they don't always know how the culture of the Islamic world is so diverse, how it's multifaceted, how it includes people of different faiths. So for us, our audiences are very varied, from people that we hope to engage with for the first time and for whom it can be the first discovery of an unfamiliar culture, and people who take that culture for granted and are surrounded by it every day and have never thought, well, why is it important that we preserve it and how does it represent us? And I mean, like everyone else, I mean, this has been a challenging year, but it's also been a year of thinking, well, how can we use technology like today to engage with people that we might never see physically because they're so far away? And we found that actually the challenges of geographic limitation, like what COVID is causing, or limitations on travel, make it even more important for us to engage, and in some ways easier to engage with people who are far away because we think about them more. And so we have a cultural engagement program, and traditionally we've done it through physical events, talks, lectures, etc. And because we're based in England, many of these have been in England. What we found through the podcast series that we've developed this year with our partner Asia House is actually we can reach many more people more effectively by doing digital initiatives. And interesting, actually, given that Islamic art is all about a visual thing, the fact that we've engaged with people through audio rather than through video is interesting because it forces specialists, it challenges specialists to talk about what's important to them in ways that make it easier for non-specialists to understand. That if you, and I'm sure Ulrike or Heba could do it, that if I said, well, you have to talk about your Iznik plate without showing it to us, or Heba could talk about costumes and fashion without showing them to us, it's a new challenge, but it somehow puts you in the position of the person that doesn't know anything about what you're talking about. So I think, like many organizations, we strive to preserve our integrity and our aims and our vision, but we do it in new and evolving ways as the world evolves.
But you know, Seif, here I have to say Islamic art is not only visual. You know, it's the way we define Islamic art that makes it exclusively visual. But, you know, to me, a qasida is a piece of art, and the visualization on that occasion as you listen to that amazing piece of poetry happens in your imagination. So we actually have to realize that there is a bouncing off of two principles, which, you know, in Arabic we say taswir al-lugha, وقراء اللوحة, which means the visualization of language and the reading of a picture, right? So it's really important to keep that in mind. So your audio is not ultimately a new thing at all. It's just in the way that we've been, all of us, conditioned to think about what Islamic art is, that we see this as an unusual thing, right?
You're right, actually. And actually it's interesting because often I come across an object from the Islamic world, I mean, many of them do have poetic inscriptions. And I always say, oh, look, I love this one. But actually, often what I love about it is not necessarily what it looks like, but what it says. The meaning of a verse of, may it bring prosperity and may you have eternal success and all of that. And sometimes in debating this with people who are less familiar, they say, well, I mean, this plate that you like looks rather plain. What is it that you find beautiful about it? And I realized that actually, what I find beautiful is not necessarily the rendering of the calligraphy, but the meanings that are conveyed in what is written.
Not the body of the object, the soul of the object.
Yes, and this actually I'd like to add in, because we are collecting the works of a Japanese calligrapher, a Muslim calligrapher, and this is exactly how he sees Islamic art from his perspective, which is the meaning of each of these verses that he actually writes in a calligraphic form. So he interprets, he reads, he understands, and then he interprets it into a lawha, as he called it, as a painting, and that actually gives us the in-depth dimension of what Islamic art is for him. And from another point of view, we have also another calligraphic panel from a very young 16 years old Malaysian calligrapher. His name is Dia, and he sees calligraphy as just a stream of letters, because when he hears the Quran and he hears the rhythm of the Quran, he may not understand it because he doesn't speak Arabic. He speaks Malaysian, he speaks Jawi, but at the end of the day, he sees it as a procession of letters coming together in a way. So yes, although we say calligraphy is the main field that we promote in our museum, yet it is interpreted very differently.
Yeah, and in many ways it is the materialization and the externalization of inner convictions, of inner visions, and that happens in many aspects of Islamic art. So I completely agree with Seif as well that, again, we need to go beyond the materiality of an object and go beyond attaching value exclusively to the materiality of an object, but take it to the value of meaning that it has to the people who use this object and peruse this object.
And at our museum, at the Islamic Art Museum, Malaysia, we actually try to become like a platform for dialogue, because we are in a society that is actually so mixed, and we get a lot of visitors from all around, mainly Asia, but around the world. So, you know, like we feel that our
I think we lost Dr. Heba. Internet connection.
Hopefully she'll come back.
Hopefully she will be able to come on.
Oh,
There she is. There she is.
We lost you for a second, Dr. Heba. Welcome back.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, and it is like exchange of ideas and as a catalyst to generate and to make available the means to explore new grounds. And from our perspective, this is our role now. And of course, with this COVID lockdowns, we realize that as a museum, it is not only our target groups which we used to communicate with and which we know are the most important target groups now, but we are trying to reach new target groups and a more diverse target groups through the internet. So we, in a way, we are starting to see, and we've been receiving a lot of proposals of different types of contemporary Islamic art, and we are investing some time to understand how the other Malaysians, for example, in South Africa or in other parts of the world, are actually understanding from their perspective their culture as Islamic in a way.
And I think it's extremely difficult to, extremely important to also remember that within one culture, there are many, many different groups that may partake the same material culture and the same art. A piece of calligraphy is not only valued by a Muslim. A poem that is manifest in calligraphy is not only appreciated by a Muslim in that society, it will be as appreciated by the Christian and the Jew and the Baha'i and Zoroastrian, whoever lives in wherever. So in this, in
Malaysia,
yeah, in this fractious world we are living in, let us use Islamic art in inverted commas as a conversation starter for inclusivity. Let us remember that people share in these arts, and let us think of how we can keep them talking to each other across the ever more widening gaps. That is something that our museum works so hard at as well, just like you were saying, because it's the only way forward, you know. Otherwise, we are even distorting the history of our field, which has always been globalized, has always been multicultural, multi-faith, and is really imprisoned by this unfortunate term that we continue to apply.
Yes, I think that one of our aims is to create a fertile ground for creativity and innovation, so that we can see and understand and promote the development or the surfacing of what is Islamic art today, and not create boundaries, but make it, you know, like more global and inclusive.
Yeah.
And I think also there's so much diversity within what we have to work with, and that's a privilege. I think it's this amazing diversity that makes it possible to provoke and stimulate this kind of discussion.
Yeah, and you know, how can you call an object Islamic art? I have one object in our collection, I'm just thinking of it, which comes under Islamic art, but the leather binding was probably made by Jewish craftsmen. The paper is Italian. The original literary work was written by a Christian doctor in Iraq. And the translator later, who rendered the work in Latin, was Jewish as well. So what is Islamic art about that? It's an object of pluralism, and that is what makes it wonderful, because that way all these different communities can celebrate the same object and be proud of it.
Yeah, and I think the idea maybe of thinking more about the arts of the Islamic world is a kind of more inclusive way than trying to say Islamic art and define what that is and what it includes and what it doesn't include.
Yeah. Yes, it's true. I think that nowadays we are really mainly using the term, the arts of the Islamic world. And of course, that gives me a boundary until the 19th century, then it does not become quite Islamic world.
Yes, let's just stop defining and take it.
I think, we should stop defining. That was just to sort of set the parameters, but apparently the parameters are too wide to be set. There's immense cultural complexity, I think, as you've all mentioned, born out of the multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, geographical diverse land and peoples that have produced and are continuing to produce Islamic tangible and intangible culture. I think this panel was really an invitation for us to engage with the subject from a different perspective and be really aware and cognizant of the nuances within the presentation and representation of Islamic art. And as again, you've all mentioned, this is an affirmation that throughout history, human innovation and creativity was never born in isolation. It happened through connection and exchange, and that we have had a rich and diverse cultural and artistic landscape that we should really take inspiration from in the way we look at and engage with our world at large. And since we're running short of time, I just wanted to ask all of you if you had any last remarks before taking maybe a few questions.
Well, I would just go ahead.
Okay.
Heba. Go ahead.
Okay. The only thing that I want to add here is the language of the designs, the language, the ornament, the language of ornament in Islamic art. And that is something that we have to also look closer at, because when we were working with the arabesque as a design or a floral design and understanding a little bit more its continuation and development, we stopped here and we said, let's try to define not just Islamic art or the arts of the Islamic world, but also the language of the ornament of the Islamic world.
Yeah, I would say I'm looking to the young generation to revisit this unwieldy field, as some fellow scholars called it once, and take it by the horns and add to the discourse and be inquisitive and knowledgeable and ask the right questions in relation to the world we find ourselves in today. And that will make this unwieldy field into something really exciting moving into the future.
Well, it's hard to add anything after Ulrike's amazing statement.
Ulrike is always saying things to the point and perfectly, don't you, Ulrike?
Well,
thank you so much for all your contributions. I have a speaker who would like to speak. Let's see if we can allow her to talk.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mhaya and Bahrain Director for Culture and Art, for setting up such a wonderful discussion. Listening to you makes me feel so good and brings me back to the days when I was a student. So thank you. I have 3 points, if I may. I'll try to be fast so I can give chance to other people also. I'll start with the easiest one. When we say Islamic art, from my perspective at least, and also studying Islamic history or learning about it, it does not mean the art of the Muslims. The Islamic civilization included different religious groups, sectarians, ethnic, class. So it's the art of all those people who lived under the Islamic civilization, regardless of their being Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, Baha'is, whatever. So it's all Islamic art, and it resonates with their experiences and their culture. The second point that I would like to raise is more of a concern that as an anthropologist I have, is that all the three of you said the need to be inclusive of all the diversity within the Islamic society. But doesn't that require that we first need to be inclusive of the local art, of the local manifestation of art, before we can reach to regional and global? And is this actually taking place or not? Mm-hmm. And when we talk about the local, we are talking about those on the periphery, the poor, the subjugated, all the women, depending on which part of the Islamic world you are talking about. or is it those who are representing the art here are the ones who have the means to talk? Which leads me to my third point, and I find it very disturbing. I teach Orientalism, and Dr. Heba said that the Orientalist painting is a mutual dialogue between East and West. Is it? Was it, from my point of view, no. It was the Western superior who had the power and who controlled the world. The Orientalist painting is their manifestation of the Middle East, of the Islamic world. I mean, just taking an example, Edward Said's book, Orientalism, and how he used the cover of the book to say it all. I think it's not a dialogue as much as opposition and enforcement of the superior over the inferior. Musalamatkum, as we say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sawsan.
Yeah, I think the comments are valid and interesting. I would say that you are absolutely right that the way the field is defined is by people that have the ability and the privilege to define it. There's no doubt about it. And I'm sure Seif has a lot to say about empowering the voices of the disenfranchised in kind of creating and defining what is Islamic art. And he spoke to that to some extent. And the engagement between the West and the East through the colonial period has definitely been a complex one that has been overshadowed by power relationships for sure. But then yet again, I would say it's not only a matter of black and white. There are many, many shades of gray in between. That again, one has to investigate as they happened, really. So and promoting the local, then the regional, and then the national, absolutely. The soul searching starts at home. And that is what I would encourage everyone who works with a field or is an artist to contribute to, so that the voices from the locality, from the nation, from the region get louder, get heard. But for that, it is essential that the young people get the right kind of education and get the right kind of exposure and ability to engage through critical thinking and not only rote learning. So there are many challenges. And I pass it to Hibba because I can see she is hoping to say something too.
No, not really. But what I'm trying to, I would like to say is that let's wait and see the exhibition and see how it is presenting itself and how is it solving all of this, or at least in attempting to solve all of these questions and showing and going deeper into the art objects that we are actually displaying. So what we are displaying is not just Orientalist paintings, but also the objects that we are producing, the object that they were producing, and how that actually in itself created that dialogue that I'm talking about. So we have to let the coronavirus go away and welcome you to our museum and to visit us when we have that exhibition on, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Dr. Hibba, and thank you, Dr. Ulrike and Seif. Thank you so much for your contributions. I see another hand. I don't know if you have time for one more question or we should end it there because we are over time.
Hello.
Hi, Valerie, you're on.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed this presentation. I will be very brief, but I want to express my own view about this problem of terminology, which dearly bothered me. I mean, as a researcher in a positive way. But for me, Islam is not at all an exclusive term, it's an inclusive term. And I think there is, I don't have any problem with the term, actually. I think it's a very proper term. It's an inclusive term. And you could say the same thing with Christianity. When you look at the history of Christianity, there were many different sects within Christianity, very many different people, and it's still the Christian world. And why that? Because there is a metaphysics behind all of that. There is metaphysics behind this term. Islam, it means an Islamic metaphysics, and we need to return to that to understand what is Islamic art. It comes from a worldview, from a worldview that is called in philosophical term logocentrism. And there is an aesthetics, there is, and Heba made the point, and also Seif showed this facade of the Institut du Monde Arabe. The ornament is Islamic art. There is a metaphysics behind it. We don't understand it, it's not explained, but it's very Muslim. It's also a type of aesthetics that can be adapted, consumed, and enjoyed by other people from other faiths. It's also an art that can be made by people of other faiths, but it's still an Islamic art. It's still related to the Quran, to the Hadith, to the positioning of the Kaaba. Oh my God, my daughter. So I think we need, my point, I think we need to return and to be serene with this notion of Islam, Islamic. That's my viewpoint, and I'm working on it. And I think it's extremely important. It's an inclusive term, but also a proper term.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Thank you. I don't know if anybody would like to comment on that. If not, then we can end this panel discussion. And thank you so much for being with us today. Our dear panelists, thank you for your time. Everybody who's joined us virtually, thank you so much. And we hope to visit one another in our respective countries and museums soon, hopefully next year. Ya Rab. And looking forward to hosting you in Bahrain very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haya.